When you hear the word slavery, what's the first image that comes to your mind? For most people, it's the towering masts of ships crossing the vast, unforgiving Atlantic Ocean. We picture people in chains, forced onto plantations, under the brutal hand of colonial powers. This is the story we've been told, the one etched into our collective memory. But what if I told you this is only one part of a much larger, much older, and far more hidden history? There is another story, one that stretches back over a millennium, long before the first European ships set sail for the Americas. It's a story of a different ocean, a different trade route, and a different kind of horror, yet one that is just as devastating. This is the story of the Arab slave trade, a dark chapter of human history that has been largely overlooked, whispered about in historical footnotes rather than taught in our classrooms. And at the very heart of this immense and prolonged tragedy were African women. Now, before we go any further, I want to be very clear. This is not a story meant to shock for the sake of entertainment. It's not about sensationalism or pointing fingers to create division. This is about restoring a truth that has been buried for too long. It's about giving a voice to the millions of women whose stories were stolen from them, whose very existence was erased from the historical record. Their suffering was real, their loss was immense, and their legacy deserves to be known. For over 1,000 years, starting as early as the 7th century, a continuous and brutal trade network snaked its way across the Sahara Desert, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. It was a trade driven by a relentless demand, and its most prized commodity was human life. Millions of African men, women, and children were captured and sold, but the experience of the women was uniquely cruel. They were targeted, hunted, and valued for reasons that went beyond simple labor. Imagine a young woman living in her village, surrounded by family, culture, and tradition. Her life is her own. One day, that life is shattered. Raiders storm her home, and she is torn away from everything she has ever known. This was the beginning of a journey into a nightmare from which there was often no escape. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which primarily sought male laborers for plantations, the Arab slave trade had a voracious appetite for women and girls. Why? The reasons are as complex as they are disturbing. These women were not just seen as laborers. They were seen as objects of pleasure, as domestic servants, and as symbols of status and wealth. They were forced into roles that stripped them of every shred of their identity. They became concubines, in harems, domestic slaves, in wealthy households, and their children, if they had any, would often inherit their mother's enslaved status, perpetuating a cycle of bondage. What they experienced was more than just the physical hardship of slavery. It was a systematic destruction of their personhood. Their names were changed, their languages were forbidden, and their cultural practices were erased. They were forced to adopt new religions, new customs, and new identities that were not their own. They were severed from their roots so completely that they became ghosts in their own lives. The journey itself was a trial by fire. Forced to march for hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles across the scorching sands of the Sahara, many did not survive. They faced starvation, dehydration, and unspeakable violence at the hands of their captors. For those who did make it to the slave markets of North Africa, the Middle East, or Asia, a new kind of hell awaited. They were put on display, inspected like animals, their bodies prodded and judged. Their value was determined by their age, their appearance, and their perceived fertility. They were sold to the highest bidder, becoming the property of men who held the power of life and death over them. Their bodies were no longer their own. They were subjected to constant sexual violence, a tool used not just for gratification, but for control and humiliation. For many of these women, death would have been a release from their suffering. But life did not offer such an escape. They were trapped in a state of living death, where their minds, bodies, and spirits were held captive. The psychological trauma was immense. They lived with the constant memory of the families they lost, the homes they were stolen from, and the lives they would never get to live. They were isolated, often being the only person from their specific culture in a household, with no one to share their language or their grief. One of the most insidious aspects of this trade was its impact on the very fabric of identity, because many of the children born from these forced unions were assimilated into the dominant culture. The African lineage was often diluted or completely erased over generations. This created a social dynamic where the history of these enslaved women and their descendants was effectively bleached from the historical and genetic narrative. It is a silent erasure, a history hidden in plain sight. The numbers are staggering and difficult to fully comprehend. Historians estimate that millions upon millions of Africans were captured and sold in the Arab slave trade over its 1300-year history. And while it's impossible to know the exact number, it's clear that women and girls made up a significant majority of the victims. Each number represents a real person, a woman with hopes, dreams, and a family that loved her. Each number represents a story of unimaginable loss. So why is this history so little known? There are many reasons. Part of it is because the historical focus has been so heavily placed on the transatlantic slave trade. Another reason is the sensitivity of the topic, which crosses complex lines of religion, race, and geography. The records are also more scattered and less centralized than the shipping logs of the Atlantic trade. But none of these reasons justify our collective amnesia. By ignoring this history, we fail to understand the full scope of the African diaspora and the deep, lasting wounds that slavery inflicted upon the continent and its people. We also fail to honor the resilience of these women. Despite everything they endured, they found ways to survive. They preserved fragments of their culture in secret. They passed down stories to their children in whispers, and they held on to their humanity in a world that tried to strip it from them. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame in the present. It's about acknowledging the past in its entirety. It is about recognizing that the legacy of slavery is not confined to one ocean or one period of time. It is a global story with many chapters, and this is one that must be read and understood. We owe it to the millions of women whose voices were silenced to tell their story, to remember their sacrifice, and to ensure that such atrocities are never forgotten and never repeated. Their story is a vital part of our shared human history. It's a story of pain, but also of incredible strength. When we think of slavery, our minds often jump to the transatlantic slave trade and European colonial empires, but that's only part of a much larger, more complex history. Long before Europeans set sail, vast networks of slavery crisscrossed Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. However, one of these systems stands out for its scale, duration, and its particularly brutal focus: the Arab slave trade. This trade wasn't a brief, dark chapter in history. It began in the 7th century, not long after the rise of Islam, and tragically continued well into the 20th century. For over 1,000 years, it carved paths of suffering across land and sea. These routes stretched from the savannas and coastlines of East and Central Africa, across the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, and deep into the heart of the Middle East and North Africa. Millions of lives were stolen and forever altered. What made this system so disturbingly unique was its overwhelming demand for women. While the transatlantic trade primarily sought male labor for grueling plantation work, the Arab slave trade was driven by a different set of desires. It was a system built on domestic servitude, social status, and, most pervasively, sexual exploitation. Women and girls were the primary targets, captured and sold to serve in homes, not fields. Their roles were multifaceted. They were domestic servants, tasked with all household chores from cooking to cleaning. They were nannies, raising the children of their enslavers. But above all, many were forced into the role of concubines, their bodies considered the property of their male owners. This created a system where sexual ownership was a key marker of wealth and power. Unlike the chattel slavery of the Americas, where slavery was often tied to race and agriculture, this was about personal control and household dominance. The children born from these forced unions often faced a complicated and uncertain status within society. The journey for these captured individuals was a brutal ordeal. Many were marched for hundreds of miles across the harsh Sahara Desert or packed onto dhows for perilous sea voyages across the Indian Ocean. The conditions were horrific. Starvation, disease, and abuse were rampant. It's estimated that for every person who survived the journey, many more perished along the way. Major slave markets, like the one in Zanzibar, became infamous centers of human misery, where people were inspected, priced, and sold like livestock. The impact on African societies was devastating and long. Entire communities were torn apart, populations were decimated, and cycles of violence were fueled as local leaders were often coerced or incentivized to participate in the raids. This constant drain of people, particularly women and young people, destabilized regions for centuries, leaving scars that are still visible today. The eventual decline of the Arab slave trade in the 20th century was a slow and complex process. driven by a combination of European colonial pressure, abolitionist movements, and internal changes within Middle Eastern societies. However, its legacy endures. It's a stark reminder that slavery is not a monolithic institution. It has taken many forms throughout history, each with its own specific horrors. By understanding this often overlooked aspect of history, we gain a more complete picture of human exploitation. It challenges our preconceptions and forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the past. This isn't about comparing atrocities, but about acknowledging all victims and understanding the deep, complex roots of slavery around the world. Thank you for watching. If you found this history insightful, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that have shaped our world. Hello and welcome back to our channel. Today, we re-delving into a complex and often overlooked chapter of history, the movement of people and goods during the expansion of Islamic empires. As these empires grew, they didn't just spread faith and culture. They also established vast and intricate trade networks that crisscrossed deserts and oceans, forever changing the world. Trade routes, both old and new, buzzed with activity. Camels, the proverbial ships of the desert, carried immense wealth. Caravans laden with gold from West Africa, aromatic spices from the East Indies, and precious ivory from the heart of the continent journeyed for months to reach the bustling markets of Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus. These cities became melting pots of cultures, goods, and ideas. The Indian Ocean transformed into a maritime highway, with dhows sailing on monsoon winds, connecting the coasts of Africa, Arabia, India, and beyond. This was an era of incredible connection, where a merchant in Morocco might trade for porcelain made thousands of miles away in China. But alongside these valuable commodities, another, far more tragic trade was also taking place: the trade in human beings. This human trade was not a monolithic enterprise. It was a complex system with many facets. And it's crucial we approach this topic with the nuance it deserves. The institution of slavery existed in many parts of the world long before this period, including within Africa itself. People were captured, bought, and sold, becoming another commodity in this burgeoning global market. They were transported across the same harsh deserts and vast oceans as the gold and spices, their humanity often disregarded in the pursuit of profit and power. Today, we will focus on the stories of the women and girls caught in this devastating trade, particularly those taken from East and Central Africa. Their experiences were unique and harrowing, and their voices, though often silenced by history, are essential to understanding the full scope of this period. We'll explore where they came from, how they were captured, and the brutal realities of their journeys. The primary sources for these women were the regions we now know as parts of Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. These areas were rich in resources and home to diverse communities, each with its own culture and social structure. In the context of the slave trade, these women were often referred to by broad, often inaccurate, regional terms like Habesha from the Ethiopian highlands or Zanje from the Swahili coast. These labels stripped them of their individual and ethnic identities, lumping them into generic categories for the convenience of traders. The methods of capture were varied and uniformly brutal. Large-scale raids were common. Armed groups, sometimes affiliated with local rulers or acting as independent warlords, would descend upon villages with little warning. These attacks were violent and chaotic, designed to overwhelm any resistance. Homes were burned, families were torn apart, and those who were not killed were rounded up and taken. For the women captured in these raids, it was a moment of absolute terror, a violent severing from everything they had ever known: their families, their homes, their entire world. Warfare between different African states and communities also fueled the trade. A victorious chief or king might sell captives from a rival tribe to traders in exchange for firearms, textiles, or other goods. This created a vicious cycle. The desire for European and Asian goods, particularly weapons, incentivized rulers to wage war, which in turn produced more captives to be sold, allowing them to acquire more weapons for further conflict. Women and children were often seen as prime captives in these scenarios, but it wasn't always large-scale violence. Kidnapping was a constant threat. Individuals, especially women and children who might be working in fields, fetching water, or traveling alone, were easy targets. A moment of distraction could lead to a lifetime of bondage. Raiders would often lie in wait near villages or along common paths, snatching people away before a cry for help could even be raised. The suddenness and randomness of these abductions created a pervasive atmosphere of fear that haunted communities. Perhaps most tragically, betrayal by one's own people was another path into slavery. Local traders, sometimes well-known members of a community, would lure people into traps. A friendly invitation or a promise of work could be a pretext for an ambush. In times of famine or extreme hardship, some desperate individuals were even forced to sell their own relatives, or team service, into servitude simply to survive. Imagine the profound sense of betrayal, being sold by a neighbor, a rival, or even a family member. Others were simply stolen from their homes in the dead of night. For these women, the moment of capture was the point of no return. Their old life was gone forever. Once captured, the journey to the coast began. This was an ordeal in itself, often called the Death March. They were given minimal food and water, just enough to keep them alive. The physical toll was immense. Many died from exhaustion, dehydration, or disease along the way. Those who faltered or tried to resist were met with extreme cruelty. The goal of the traders was to deliver their goods to market. The psychological trauma was just as devastating. Stripped of their names, their identities, and their dignity, these women were treated as less than human. They couldn't communicate with everyone, as captives were often from different ethnic groups speaking different languages. Upon reaching coastal slave markets like Zanzibar, Kilwa, or Suakin, the survivors faced another horror: the auction block. Here, they were inspected like livestock. Their teeth, eyes, and bodies were examined by prospective buyers to assess their health and strength. Their youth and physical appearance could dramatically increase their price. This objectification was the ultimate degradation, the final confirmation that they were no longer people, but property. From these coastal ports, the journey continued across the water. Those sold into the trans-Saharan trade faced a grueling trek across the world's largest hot desert. The journey by camel caravan could take months, and the conditions were brutal. Water was strictly rationed, and the relentless sun was a killer. Many did not survive. Others were packed onto dhows for the Indian Ocean crossing. While often depicted as less horrific than the transatlantic Middle Passage, the conditions were still appalling. The ships were overcrowded, unsanitary, and diseased. Women were particularly vulnerable to abuse by the crew during the long voyage. The destination could be Arabia, Persia, the Ottoman Empire, or even as far as India. Upon arrival, they were sold again in the slave markets of major cities.